One of the main Shemitah trends of late 2016 is the emerging war in the Middle East. It has every indication of turning into a conflict resembling World War III, and day by day is becoming more dangerous and extreme. This could be the war that finally triggers the great economic collapse being planned. Certainly, the storm clouds of war are gathering, as we've been covering. In fact, on Friday, Barack Obama is scheduled to decide whether or not to initiate direct U.S. military action against Syria, in part because of Russia's bombing of Aleppo. Obama has been forced into making this decision because the Russians, along with the Syrians, are now winning the war. The wars in Libya, Iraq, and now Syria are bankers' wars, intended to redraw the map in the Middle East while adding to the military burdens of the West, specifically the U.S. And the propaganda continues to grow stronger in the West, with the U.S. and NATO constantly proclaiming the dangers of terrorism that they helped foster. In this sense, the wars are entirely artificial and can be called off by the West at any time. Instead, Western powers are stoking the flames, and Russia and China are starting to pile in as well. From Russia's point of view, the attacks are anything but optional, and while Russia didn't get involved in Western attacks for years, now that the attacks have reached Syria, Russia has begun to fight back. Russia began by bombing ISIS terrorists that Russian generals soon observed had not been bombed by the U.S. at all. Now Russia is providing air cover and bombing for Assad's attack on Aleppo, an important urban center which he wants to retake. Assad reclaiming this city would be seen as a significant U.S. military setback. Obama may not decide on active confrontation in Aleppo, but his consideration of direct action against Syria and Russia shows just how close the world is to a war between superpowers. It's a crazy time to be alive, isn't it? Between war and economic depression, it's hard to know where to turn. Things are ramping up in numerous directions. It was recently announced, for instance, that Chinese forces are heading to Syria to link up with Russia to fight the Islamic State, which is actually the US and the CIA. In fact, Chinese warships are apparently headed to the Middle East as well, which adds yet another element to this massive confrontation. Syrian government forces, increasingly backed by Russian air power, are taking back Aleppo, as noted previously. Syrian success regarding Aleppo is giving the Pentagon problems, which is likely why Hillary Clinton mentioned it during the last presidential debate, where she advocated a no-fly zone and safe zones in the region. This suggestion was promptly blasted by officials on both sides of the aisle, who recognized that declaring a no-fly zone in Aleppo would almost immediately start a full-blown war between Russia and the U.S., perhaps including nuclear weapons. Already, Russia seems involved in hostilities well beyond what's taking place in the sky. On Wednesday, mortar fire was aimed at Russia's embassy in Damascus. The shelling lasted 2 hours and perhaps was intended to send a message to Russia regarding its plans to establish a permanent airbase in Syria. While the U.S. is not being directly shelled in Syria, it is in Yemen, where Iranian-affiliated Houthis sent 2 missiles in the direction of a U.S. destroyer in the Red Sea. In return, the U.S. military shelled a radar system in the area. Meanwhile, U.S. intelligence agencies have been accused of aiming more than missiles in Russia, where President Putin's favorite chauffeur was killed in what many have suggested was an assassination attempt. CCTV footage taken on Kutuzovsky Avenue in Moscow reveal another vehicle crossing the highway divider to crash head-on into the presidential BMW, which Putin would normally be in, but wasn't that day. Putin hasn't commented on the crash directly, but one of his Russian ultranationalist allies has issued a statement telling U.S. voters that the alternative to a Trump presidency is nuclear war. Vladimir Zhirinovsky, who is well known for his confrontational style, said in an interview that Trump was the last hope for de-escalating Moscow-DC tensions. If there's one thing I've learned about how elite confrontations are managed, it's that usually both sides are eagerly participating in making the tension worse. It's usually all manufactured, but that doesn't make it any less dangerous. Both World War I and II were similarly designed. Both sides cooperated to create military tensions that eventually exploded and ended up killing hundreds of millions. World War I killed 40 million. World War II killed 70 million. How many could die in World War III? No one knows, but given the nuclear arsenal of both sides, we agree with Einstein that World War IV could very well be fought with sticks and stones. Recently, the Russians have considerably upped domestic alarmism over Western actions. For instance, Russians have just been told to bring their family members and relatives back to Russia. In this stern warning, Russians were also warned that their professional careers and promotions may be affected if they fail to comply. Russia is also setting up a military self-defense exercise that will supposedly involve 40 million or more. These massive movements of people and armaments based on the prospects of war serve Putin's agenda well. He is gaining more and more power over Russian society as a consequence of blatant Western aggression. Usually the West and Russia escalate slowly and stop well before the possibility of accidental conflict. But much as the US seems to be acting with unusual aggression, Russia is doing likewise. Russian jets have closed in on US ground troops and naval vessels in a confrontational posture, while claiming that NATO deployments in the Middle East and around Ukraine are aggressive steps. With so many risks looming, you would think both sides would try to scale back their aggression. But this assumes that war is not wanted. As we know, and I wrote about in my book, Shemitah Trends, war is a necessary part of elite control. In this case, the war expanding in Syria that is gradually setting Russia against the US will act as the trigger for an economic collapse. The collapse, in turn, will usher in further chaos and expanded globalization. One can see the preparations taking place. On the surface, there are explanations for everything, but underneath, a plan is operative. Since 2008, central banks around the world have boosted liquidity while shoving down rates to ludicrous, even negative levels. This cannot stand for long and is not meant to. It is intended to create a titanic bubble that will inevitably pop. Central bank monetary inflation will not be blamed for the catastrophic crash and subsequent worldwide depression. Instead, some sort of military confrontation will be blamed. In turn, this will give those who operate central banks plausible deniability. They'll say, it wasn't central banking that caused the crash, but an unstoppable world war. Here's how Zero Hedge put it in an article entitled The March to World War III. Over the last 3 years, the US government and the pathetic parrots of the mainstream media have accused Russia of any and every transgression possible, save for, perhaps, kicking puppies or molesting children. One must strongly suspect that all these lies and innuendo had and have a purpose. And the most likely purpose, by far, is the orchestration of World War III. What's going on is worldwide, and is so vast and evil in scope that it's hard to fully understand it. Stick with us and join our growing worldwide community of dollar vigilantes at dollarvigilante.com/subscribe so that you can get a sense of what's occurring and when. What's going to take place is literally without comparison in the whole of human history, and you need to protect yourself and your family as much as possible. It's my pledge to help position our viewers in the best way possible to survive and prosper through what's coming. World war and a global economic depression will create a terrible combination of events, but if we prepare in advance, we'll be a step ahead in confronting what's to come.